Let's take a look at his discussion of the philosopher kings at 473d as a preliminary conclusion to some of the remarks that we've been saying. So remember that from this class of guardians, a select few, right, those who are the greatest lovers of wisdom, rise then into this kind of ruling position, right? So that this philosopher kings, the philosopher are the lovers of knowledge. So from a group of people who've already been selected for their enthusiasm for wisdom, you select those who are the most enthusiastic, and they become these philosopher kings. And he writes, there is no end to suffering, Glaucon, this is Socrates speaking, for our cities, and none, I suspect, for the human race, unless either philosophers become kings in our cities, or the people who are now kings and rulers become in the truest and most complete sense of the word philosophers. Unless there is this amalgamation of political power and philosophy with all those people whose inclination is to pursue one or other exclusively, being forcibly prevented from doing so. Otherwise, there is not the remotest chance of the political arrangements we have described coming about. So until our rulers become philosophers, or our philosophers incline to rule, we will not be able, as he says, to end the suffering of the human race. The human race is destined to suffer until we are capable of instituting this system of philosopher kings. This is an interesting hinge point for us because that sounds like this is not a utopian project, is it? Human suffering, is that real? Yes. Absolutely, right? That is a real artifact of existence. Therefore, if he's saying the only way we can end human suffering is in some way to elaborate a system that allows for the emergence of the philosopher king, doesn't that suggest that a system that's designed precisely to do that is not some fanciful thought experiment, some utopian idea, but instead a project that has as its goal a very compelling objective to end human suffering? If you want to end human suffering, this is what you have to do. Much like we might say, if your tooth is aching, you have to go to the dentist and have it pulled out. There is a condition, and if you want to rectify the condition, you have to pursue a certain course of action, which would suggest that the whole idea of the Republic is not a utopia, at least as Socrates is conceiving it, but instead has a kind of practical urgency about it insofar as ending human suffering is a good goal. Yeah.
Yes, he's proposing a resolution, but it's still a utopia. His solution is utopic. It wouldn't happen, never.
Well, this indeed has been the subject of an enormous amount of debate. There's actually two questions, really. The first is, could a city like this ever happen? And I think many of us would agree that seems highly unlikely. But the second question is, does he intend for a city like this to happen? Is this even a serious exercise in political philosophy? If the sole purpose of this is to construct some fanciful, imaginary polis, the sole purpose of which is to get us to the point where we can define justice as the equilibrium of the soul, then the whole political component of this can be discarded. We can say we don't need to worry about the politics of this because the politics are themselves not serious. They're just fanciful. So if it's purely intended as a kind of ridiculous thought experiment, then we shouldn't be reading this as a work of political philosophy. We should simply be reading this as a work of ethical philosophy, right? Or moral philosophy. But if we take that statement seriously, and remember there are other points in the text where he seems to suggest much the same kind of thing. Not that this is merely a flight of fancy, but that in fact that this is built out of real observations about real people, and in other words, this does have links to some sort of actual reality, then indeed it does invite us to take the politics that's here seriously, right? Then we do need to ask, is this intended as a serious political exercise? The question of whether it's possible is perhaps, it's a question of how we define utopia. Is it possible to build a society where people are divided into class? Is it possible to create a society where only some people get to rule and others are excluded? Is it possible to create a society where we define who people are based on the education that we provide them? Yes. Say you, sitting in a nice elite university, the answer to that is obviously yes. Is it possible for us to imagine this kind, in other words, these kinds of arrangements? And in fact, if we strip it out of some of its more jarring elements, like, for example, stripping children from their parents or exposing them to horrific acts of violence at the age of 4. If we were to update it perhaps with some of the latest learning that we have about, say, positive biological outcomes, aren't many of the features of this imaginary, seemingly utopic city not that far from the kinds of realities that we live in our own? Is there not a ruling class that tends to dominate power? Does that ruling class not tend to perpetuate itself? Is there not, in fact, even in our own society, if you will, a kind of informal style of animal husbandry, in the sense that wealthy people tend to marry other wealthy people, poor people tend to marry other poor people, and essentially reproduce generationally, intergenerationally, the sort of environment that they are around? I mean, all of these things, in some ways, are already operative in our own society. If we accept we already live in a society where one class already rules, if we already live in a society where the information we receive is being controlled, right? If we live in a society where these constraints are, how much of a leap of it is therefore to say, well, if that's the reality, let's see if we can create more agency about how we're going to define the people that are going to rule us. If we accept that that's already the way it is, wouldn't it be nice if we can then make sure that the best people are going to be part of that ruling class? It's not to say that that is necessarily achievable, but is that not desirable? If you accept already that only certain people are going to be able to rise into positions of authority, wouldn't it be nice to know that the people who are going to attain that position actually have the best interests of the society at heart? Yeah.
I don't get why you're calling it like a utopia. It sounds completely horrible to me. Like, it sounds like a dystopia of anything, where it's like, it looks like it's all perfect, but in reality, it's horrible. I mean, it's all based on lies and assuming that people are just and that they have your best interests at heart when they could be lying to you.
Well, I mean, essentially, isn't that Thrasymachus' point? We saw that, remember, Thrasymachus the sophist saying, look, what is justice? Justice is what the powerful want it to be. Justice is what happens to other people, right? Not to you. If you're like a little person in the system, justice is what serves the interests of those who have more power than you do. I mean, essentially, that's kind of what Thrasymachus says. That's a realistic reading of human nature. Or, Glaucon, justice is what you do because you don't want to get a bad reputation, right? So what Socrates is trying to do is to say, is there another way of, how does that explain then why people might incorporate into their own lives the desire to be just, if it's merely an expediency or a convention? I'm not here to tell you that the Republic is a realistic political project, because it clearly is not. Because we couldn't even imagine this. Simply the point about it is, and it's not a question that we can answer. I mean, a lot of people have debated this. The question is, does Socrates intend this as a serious exercise in political thinking, or is it merely a vehicle for thinking through this problem of justice as it exists in the individual? And I think to simply offer the possibility that we should read it, at least in part, as a political exercise, the way in which it does correlate to elements that we can recognize around us, at the very least, should get us to be thinking about those elements. We may not reach to the solutions that are there. I mean, the answer to a problem of power being concentrated inside of a self-reproducing class is not to generate some kind of eugenics program and create sort of a communal nurturing environment for future leaders. That's absurd. But it does raise the question about, if you are living in a society where power is perpetuated and concentrated in the hands of certain people intergenerationally, what then does that suggest about how we should think about how power is arrayed inside the state? So, to simply conclude, I'm not saying it is a utopia, I'm not saying it isn't a utopia. What I'm saying is that for all the reasons we might be inclined to discard as absurd, or as you might put, dystopic, these elements of the Republic, at the same time there are elements inside of it that, in fact, I think are compelling and worth our attention. If you are a woman living in ancient Greece, how dystopic is this society? The very fact that it allows you to reclaim your individuality in a context outside of the family, I'm assuming that if you're sitting in this room as a woman right now, sounds like a pretty good thing, compared to the alternative, which is to be subordinated and made invisible by social apparatuses that will surround you your entire life. So in that sense, we might say, well, it does, in fact, seem to have certain features that we like. So I want to come to this last point then in the few minutes that remain, the so-called Empyrean thesis of Plato. It's a very famous issue. Popper wrote a book in the 1940s called The Open Society. You may know George Soros, inspired by this, and he has a philanthropic foundation called The Open Society. It comes from the Popper idea. Popper was an Austrian thinker whose parents, actually I think his grandparents were Jewish. He himself, I believe, was Lutheran, because like many Jews of the late 19th century, his parents had converted to better fit into German-speaking society. But as a Jew, or as a descendant of Jews, he had to flee Austria in the 1930s ahead of the Anschluss. And so it's in the context of this encroaching fascism that he writes this book, The Open Society. And the famous thesis of The Open Society, and it's what he calls historicism, which we would call an embedded destiny that unfolds through history, which he's very critical of. The famous thesis is that Plato, the Platonic exercise in the Republic, in other words, the Platonic political agenda, is a totalitarian agenda. That the Republic sets out and creates inside Western political thinking totalitarian impulses by virtue of the language that it uses. What do we mean by totalitarian? That power is concentrated overwhelmingly, absolutely inside the state. That the state comes before the individual. We might say that it creates this dyad, this duality, which I'm taking from Popper himself, who points out that we have, on the one hand, the idea of the collective, which is altruistic, acting in the interests of others, versus the individual who acts for herself, which is a kind of egoism. And so how Popper read Plato was in this sort of construction of a guardian class, whether we call it utopian or dystopian, but in this construction, what is embedded at the heart of this ideal political society? A group of people who are raised in the consciousness of collective so that they may act altruistically. Hence, they don't get to have property. They don't have their own children. They simply are part of this larger experiment and so on. The whole point, then, of the people who are in charge of the state is they are not defined as individuals. They're de-individualized, as we saw. Instead, they are reformed or recast or recreated inside of a collective identity. The purpose of which is to be able to leverage their sense of justice, right, in order to act altruistically, meaning not for themselves but for others, to defend the best interests of the society as a whole. And so therefore, if you're living inside of the polis, inside of the republic, inside of a state, instead of living in a world of individuals who are acting for themselves, better is to live in a world where power is expressed collectively, which can then come through in altruistic ways. That's essentially the argument that Popper wants to put out, that Plato's ideal republic, this model of power, suggests that human suffering is located in the problem of individualism. That the problem of individual rulers, right, that thing about the philosopher kings, until kings become philosophers or philosophers become kings, there is no end in sight to human suffering. And so therefore, what is it that characterizes the philosopher? The wisdom to think beyond himself, the wisdom to be in equilibrium between his appetites, the capacity to be perfectly just and therefore perfectly happy, the capacity to move, to transcend his own individuality, right, and attain some understanding of the collective and therefore to be able to act in the collective good, to act as an altruistic agent. For Popper, having fled Nazi power in the 1930s in Austria, looking then at this question of where did totalitarianism come from, he argued that it had this deep tradition inside Western thinking, and that no less than Plato had essentially set out a means for establishing totalitarian power. Because the principle is, if only those who operate inside the collective are capable of acting what is best for the state, what capacity does the individual have to object, to complain, to reclaim her own individuality in that context? And the answer is very little to none, because reclaiming your own individuality in that context is essentially not only a subversive act, but it goes against definitionally the social or the public good. The individual becomes inimical to the public good. Instead, the public good is located in an apparatus of power which alone can claim to represent the collective interests of society. For Popper, that was essentially the argument of totalitarianism. Totalitarian regimes speak the language of overwhelming the individual in order to achieve some kind of higher good, in order to drive society towards some kind of greater aim, to recast society in some better way. And the individual is not a building block of that project, but an obstacle to that project. And so the feature of totalitarianism that Popper looked at, that it recreates citizens all in the same way, with the same way of thinking, aligned towards the same objective, mobilizing collective mass thinking, collective mass action, mobilizing also the tools, political tools that Plato lays out, things like, for example, state-sponsored propaganda to ensure that people are thinking in the right way. All of these elements that Popper could see around him as characteristic of fascism in Europe in the 1930s, he found that in the Republic. He said that these kinds of elements justifying propaganda, justifying lying, justifying the concentration of state power in the hands of a few, exercising it over the individual, de-individualizing, or shall we say, diminishing the importance of an individual. All of these constituent elements of totalitarianism can be found in the Platonic project. He's not wrong. He may not be right, but he's not wrong. The only thing we can say, perhaps, is that Plato is rescued by his own inconsistency. Because generally speaking, wherever he says one thing, he'll contradict himself a little bit later. So we can read Plato in one way, along this kind of Popperian totalitarian lines, but it's perfectly possible also to read it in a way that completely undermines that argument. Let's recall, for example, that at one point he says, not that the just city creates just individuals, which would be the totalitarian reading, starting with the state, which then produces an individual outcome. He says the just city is made up of just individuals. The justice of the state reflects the justice of the individual. It puts the emphasis on the individual, not on the state. The second element that we might say, and I'm going to finish with this final point, is his well-known contempt for democracy, which says democracy is an inherently disequilibrated system. Democracy is a kind of radical freedom that defies the ability to create a good balance, that if we have the perfect freedom to do whatever we want, that we won't be able to balance our appetites with our desires, with our reason, etc. Perfect freedom is inconsistent with equilibrium of the soul. And he then equates that to democracy in the state. Democracy represents this kind of disequilibrium. And for this reason, then, he's extremely contemptuous of democracy. Democracy is one of the worst forms of government, thereby, I should note, incidentally insulting Athens, right, which was the famous Greek democracy. Although he had also insulted other forms: oligarchy, ruled by the wealthy, or plutocracy, ruled by the wealthy, timocracy, ruled by the honorable, which was the model in Sparta. But it's for democracy alone that he says the problem of democracy is that it leads to tyranny. He says this at 464a, that democracy is the breeding ground of tyranny, and therefore we must treat it with the utmost suspicion. Tyranny then comes out of the ability to appeal to those elements in a popular mass and present some sort of message that is restrictive. But the purpose here is, although there are elements of the state that may seem inclined towards totalitarian models of power, he specifically rejects the notion of tyranny, that a state that behaves tyrannically is not a state that can be just. And so if there's an argument or a way of rescuing Plato from Popper's accusation in the Open Society that Plato serves as a blueprint for totalitarianism, surely we need not go much further than his absolute and categorical rejection of tyranny as a form of power. The fact that he links tyranny to democracy may seem offensive to some of us, but at the same time, again, in our existing day and age, we ourselves have an anxiety over the way in which populist political messages can be leveraged in order to create what we would consider to be suboptimal political outcomes. And I think something along those lines that Plato wants to draw our attention to. People are easily manipulated or swayed, and it can lead then to outcomes that are highly undesirable. Okay, there's a lot to think about there and all of that stuff. We will end our discussion of Plato there. I will see you next week, and we will turn our attention to the Politics by Aristotle. As I mentioned in our introduction, the first thing Aristotle does in the Politics is criticize this book. So we'll see Aristotle's criticism. And for those of you who think that Plato's Republic is totally ridiculous and absurd, Aristotle completely agrees with you, and so we'll enjoy that critique when we come back next week. Have a good weekend.